Hello everyone, welcome to the next installment. Artemis, Selene, and Hekate, the triple goddess? No. As we'll learn here, these are three distinct goddesses, each of whom has their own vastly disparate mythological traditions. Each of whom has their own vastly different mythological traditions. Why are they so often syncretized and imagined as three faces of the same goddess? In one word, the answer to this is the moon. But when we look more carefully into their myths, it does turn out that both Artemis and Hekate started out as non-lunar goddesses. When rarely they are identified in later Hellenistic and Roman sources, their domains and functions remain distinct. It is not their myths which get cross-wired, as it were, but rather their philosophical or religious cult. In this lecture, we'll be covering Artemis first, then Selene, then Hekate. So let's begin with Pausanias' testimony on the goddess Artemis and his description of Greece. He recalls a story among the Capuans in which some children were playing around the sanctuary. They found some rope and tied it around the neck of the statue and pretended that the goddess was being hanged. The pious Capuans, fearing retribution from Artemis, stoned their own children to death. This did not please the goddess, and a sickness fell upon the wives of those who had done such things. They now only had premature birth to stillborn babies. The oracle at Delphi, the Pythia, was consulted, and she decreed that the stoned children must be buried, and that sacrifices must be offered to them every year, for they had been unjustly killed. Not burying someone in Greek myth and religion is equivalent to outcasting them from any possible well-being for their soul in the world beyond. And it's pretty brutal that the children were here not only stoned to death, but also exposed without burial. The Capuans, of course, repented, and they perform this ritual in accordance with the oracle and call Artemis the hanged goddess, Artemis Apanchomene. And in this disturbing tale, we can also see very clearly three of Artemis's chief attributes. She is a goddess of children's play, vengeful against her enemies but protective of children, and of Zeus's justice. As to the birthplace of Artemis, there's a big dispute in the mythological tradition of whether she was born along with her brother on the island of Delos or at Ortugia. Apollodorus tells us that the pregnant Leto was hounded by the jealous Hera all over the earth, and that she finally reached an island which would accept her, Delos, whereupon she gave birth to Artemis first and Apollo second. Ovid concurs with this account of Leto's persecuted wandering, identifying Delos as the island where she bore both children. But the much earlier Homeric hymn seems more aware of the controversy. Rejoice, O blessed Leto, since you have borne splendid children, Lord Apollo and Artemis, who takes delight in arrows. Artemis you bore in Ortugia, and Apollo in rocky Delos as you leaned against the great and massive Cynthian hill. The Syracusan peninsula of Italy, also known as Ortugia, thus still claims itself today to be the proper birthplace of Artemis. Here you see a statue dedicated to her there. But there was also an ancient Ortugia closer to Ephesus, a great city of Artemis, and Otto thinks that birthplace is more likely. Pindar, in the most beautiful version of Artemis's birth, already throws in his chips with the Delians. Hail, O heaven-built island, that is Delos, most lovely scion of the children of bright-haired Leto, O daughter of the sea, thou unmoved marvel of the spacious earth, by mortal men called Delos, but by the blessed gods of Olympus known as the far-seen star, Astra of the dark blue sea. There it was that she gave birth to and beheld her blessed offspring. Apparently, this controversy was still going on in the 1st to 2nd centuries CE. The Orphic hymn to Leto singing, Dark-veiled Leto, much invoked queen, twin-bearing goddess, Phoebus, Apollo proceeds from thee, the god of light and Artemis fair, whom winged darts delight, she in Ortugia's honored regions born, in Delos he, which lofty mountains adorn. These variants seem to pretty clearly express a rivalry of the island of Ortugia and Delos as the most sacred places of Artemis and Apollo. The Homeric hymn to Artemis sings beautifully of her epithets, attributes, and appearance. The much shorter 9th Homeric hymn begins, Musa sing of Artemis, sister of the far-shooter Hecatos, Parthenos, virgin who delights in arrows, Iokaira, who was fostered with Apollo. The 27th Homeric hymn is much more vivid on the attributes of her appearance. I sing of Artemis, whose shafts are of gold, strong-voiced Chaldean, the revered virgin, dear shooting, Elaphebelos, delighter in arrows, own sister to Apollon of Chrysaor, the golden sword. Over the shadowy hills and windy peaks she draws her golden bow, rejoicing in the chase, and sends out grievous shafts. The tops of the high mountains tremble, and the tangled wood echoes awesomely with the outcry of beasts. Earth quakes, and the sea also, where fishes shoal. But the goddess, with a bold heart, turns every way, destroying the race of wild beasts. And when she is satisfied and has cheered her heart, then the huntress, who delights in arrows, slackens her supple bow, and goes to the great house of her dear brother Phoebus Apollo, to the rich land of Delphoi, there to order the lovely dances of the Musai and the Charites, and there she hangs up her curved bow and her arrows, and heads and leads the dances, gracefully arrayed, while all there utter in heavenly voice, singing of how neat-ankled Leto bore children supreme among the immortals, both in thought and deed. Hail to you, children of Zeus and rich-haired Leto. Artemis seems to be born first so that in her function as a goddess of childbirth, she can assist in Apollo's birth. And she shares this role with Hera and Eileithyia, as we've seen. Within Delos, Mount Cynthus claims the honor of being Artemis's birthplace, and hence she is called Cynthian. In Ovid's version of Hera's persecution of a pregnant Leto, she had first come to Lycia to give birth, but the Lycians refused to allow her to drink water from a marsh, and in anger she turned them into frogs. Ever in myth and religion, Artemis is closely linked to Apollo, both appearing as vehement and haughty agents of destruction with their shafts of doom. Sudden death, particularly of the young, was attributed to these deities. In other myths, however, their shafts are often more gentle, even when they bring death. Although a fierce huntress goddess of the wilderness, is pretty cool that Artemis will on occasion join her handsome brother in supervising the dances of the Muses and the Graces. We could say that Artemis and Apollo are the two most playful Greek deities, but also the most destructive. In iconography, Artemis usually appears as a huntress taking an arrow from her quiver, but also as a maternal protectress of animals and children, especially young girls. She shows tender solicitude, but also disdain, haughtiness, and cruelty. A cold maiden who might be responsible either for the apotheosis or death of the girls. Artemis's bird is the quail, which gives Ortugia its name. Otto notes that this migratory bird is an appropriate symbol for the goddess of distance. The goddess carries not only a quiver, but often a spear, torch, lyre, or water jug, and she is either clothed in a knee-length girl's dress or in a full-length robe, often with a cloak and headgear, which might be a crown, a tiara, a headband, or an animal pelt cap. Sometimes she or her statue is draped in a pelt of deer. In the most archaic representations, she, like Selene, is depicted as winged, but this attribute doesn't stick for either of them. Consistently, Artemis is associated with wilderness haunts, forests, and mountains, but on rare occasion, like the goddess Athena, she's depicted as protecting cities. She assists in childbirth, although herself ever a virgin, and she's often represented as present in scenes of infant or child mortality. This is not really a contradiction in Greek mythical thought. Any goddess who protects and preserves something must also be imagined as persecuting and destroying it. As Otto puts this in Myth and Religion, Apollo and Artemis are the most majestic, grandiose, magnificent, fearsome, and sublime of the Greek gods. In poetry and in plastic arts, the attribute of purity or holiness is peculiar to them. Apollo's main epithet, Phoebus, means pure or holy, and Artemis is the only goddess whom Homer honors with the epithet Hagne, which also means pure and holy, but also wild. Artemis's purity is expressed in natural precincts, forests, fields of flowers, mountain peaks, or springs of the purest water. She is a mysterious, unapproachable, and ever-distant goddess, Otto here making a contrast with Athena as the ever-near. Nevertheless, as a far shooter who sees from afar, Artemis's aim is ever accurate, even across the greatest distances. She loves wilderness, solitude, her nymphs, playing with wild beasts, and is chaste and ever fierce. Those who pursue her or even catch a glimpse of her very often suffer the most dire fates in all of mythology. Otto sums her up pretty lucidly. Her whole quality is unfettered being, raised above all bonds. She is a mirror of divine femininity, but not the great Holy Mother who gives birth to all life. Rather, virginal, free nature in its brilliance and wildness, with its guiltless purity and its uncanniness. Rilke's poem Cretan Artemis, included this week, sums up these attributes well when he sings, "Wind of the foothills, wasn't her brow like some luminous object? Smooth fall wind of the sure-footed animals, you gave her form. her clothes building upon the naive breasts like a fickle premonition, while she, as if she already knew everything, even at a distance, dress-readied and composed, stormed off with her nymphs and dogs, testing her bow bound to her high belt, all the while, at times, called only to foreign settlements and furious, forced to move swiftly by the cries of birth. Rilke's poem here neatly pointing to the paradox of Artemis's nature. How can the goddess of free wilderness also be tasked with attending the cries of those who give birth? Truth be told, for Rilke, she seems pretty furious in having to fulfill this duty and being distracted from her wilderness hunting revels. Rilke's Artemis is Cretan rather than Ephesian, because in Ephesian depictions of this goddess, her maternal aspect is often emphasized, such as in her famous statue where she has many draping breasts. The Artemis of which Rilke sings is more that depicted on the famous Francois vase, where she is shown in profile, winged and wearing a peplos, belted and descending on her feet, holding a panther in one hand and a stag in the other. This is Artemis as the original mistress of the animals, or potnia theron. The rest of the vase shows her lifting a lion by the scruff with both hands, as if it were a cat. This Artemis seems to feel endlessly uneasy, well nigh furious about being forced to move swiftly by the cries of those giving birth. In his Heraclitus lectures, Heidegger gets right to the essence of this goddess, naming her a goddess of Physis, what the Greeks called natural things. Quote, Artemis, the sister who along with her brother hails from Delos, bears the same signs as her brother, lyre and bow, which in a mysterious way, hence also in their outer form, are the same. The lyre is a symbol of string music and its harmonia. When we contemplate Artemis, the essence of play strikes us vividly. The Greeks know her as the huntress, goddess of the hunt, and we believe naively that we know what they mean by this. We're only on the right track here when we realize that hunting and animals belong in nature, and so for Heidegger, Artemis is the goddess of Physis, and her playmates the nymphs play the game of Physis. The word Physis itself names for Heidegger the self-opening or coming forth and emerging up and upwards into unconcealed standing there and rising. That is, again, you guessed it, Artemis, like Poseidon, Athena, or any Greek deity, is a god of being for Heidegger, in the earlier form to wit of the word being, pelein, playing forth. The goddess of Physis, Artemis, is ever rising, and hence always appearing in an elevated form. Her beauty is one of lofty and stately appearance, and those maidens to whom Artemis is well disposed are given great stature. Heidegger next goes into more detail on a very important and understudied accoutrement of the goddess, her torch. Artemis appears with torches in both hands, and here she is called phosphoros, or the light bringer. The essence of light, Greek phaios or phos, is the illumination that first lets something appear and thus lets the unconcealed come forth from out of concealment. Artemis as goddess of Physis and as Phosphoros, the light-bearer, basically say the same, an emerging, self-expanding into the open and lighted. And so Artemis is the goddess of emergence, of light, and of play. In his most profound speculations on Artemis, Heidegger explains why she's associated not only with the bow, but with Apollo's instrument, the lyre, and how bow and lyre, both bios in Greek, are related to the Greeks' basic understanding of life. Quote, her sign is the lyre, which appears in the form of the bow. Speaking in Greek, it's the same as the bow, for the lyre, understood as the bow, sends the arrows that bring death. Civilizing the goddess somewhat, the deaths that Artemis's arrows send are sudden, gentle, and loving. But we still can't evade the fact that Artemis, as goddess of emergence, play, and light, is also a goddess of death. How can the goddess of self-illuminating, of emerging, of playing, be at the same time a goddess of death, of the dark, of submergence, and the rigid? This is because life and death, the musical lyre, and the deadly bow, are ever turning against and into one another. Life and death, like lyre and bow, are in strife, eros. And for Heidegger, what this means is that although ever distant, Artemis is also the nearest of all. Her bow, which brings death, and the lyre, which sings life, come together in Artemis as the purest form of nearness, i.e. farness. More simply, Artemis is above all a goddess of life and of death, of the paradoxical unity of opposites. And all this Heidegger explains in the context of an interesting anecdote about the philosopher Heraclitus, the first proponent of the idea of the unity of opposites in Western thought. Heraclitus hailed from Artemis's greatest city, Ephesus, and even placed his book on nature in the temple of Artemis there as a city treasure to be safeguarded. Once, when the philosopher had withdrawn into the temple in order to play knucklebones with the children, his fellow Ephesians stood around him gawking, and he said to them, "What are you gaping at, you scoundrels? Is it not better to do this than to work with you on behalf of the polis?" What's so funny for the Ephesians, according to Heidegger, is that Heraclitus has withdrawn into a holy precinct, but doesn't seem concerned with the goddess. Rather, he plays a dice game or knucklebones with the children. Everyone is expecting him to be serious and profound, but instead he plays games with the kiddos, knowing full well that this playing is what is holy to Artemis. Heidegger draws from this scene a very generalized statement about the nature of Greek religion. Whereas we think of religion as something very serious, what binds the mortal and the divine together through the observance of holy law, according to Heidegger, for the Greeks, there is no religion in this sense, rather only a gathering, from Cicero's other etymology of the word religion, religere, of mortals and the gods in a sacred precinct. And this latter sense of religion Heraclitus indeed performs, to wit in the very same sanctuary, the Artemision, that still stood in the late Greek period when St. Paul on his mission preached to the Ephesians. The Artemision in this time becomes the site of the Ephesians' uprising against Paul's preaching, and they chanted that Ephesus is the town of the great Artemis, didn't you know, for 2 long hours. For Heidegger, Heraclitus' nearness to the gods and especially to Artemis is obvious from this story alone, and his preference for playing children's games could be interpreted politically as a rejection of the polis by means of absurdity and siding with the goddess. Another famous fragment of Heraclitus related to Artemis reads, "The world is a game Zeus plays." Another beautiful place to add to your itinerary in Greece. You can still go to Artemision, already considered a wonder of the world in ancient times today. And it was there, more than any other Artemis sanctuary, in which the goddess was explicitly worshipped as a protectress of nature, Physis, an original fertility goddess, perhaps long before her virginal associations, as indicated by her many draping breasts. So that being an introduction to the characteristics and attributes of Artemis, let's turn now with Athanassakis to Artemis in myth and cult. From Homer, we glean that our earliest myths of Artemis associate her with human sacrifice. When the Greek army is mustering at Aulis for their expedition to Troy, Agamemnon kills a deer sacred to Artemis. The goddess prevents the Greeks from sailing, and the seer Calchas reveals that Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia as recompense to Artemis. He grimly complies in Homer and also in Aeschylus. In Hesiod's version, Artemis substitutes a deer for Iphigenia at the last moment, and much has been written about how this relates to myths of Abrahamic sacrifice. And even more strangely, also in Hesiod, Iphigenia, upon dying, becomes the goddess Hekate here. There's a wonderful chapter on this in Sarah Ailes Johnston's book, The Restless Dead, which we'll turn to when we get to Hekate. In Euripides' version, Iphigenia at Taurus, Orestes, her brother, rescues Iphigenia, and she becomes a priestess to Artemis in concealment. It seems already from this that connections of the goddess Artemis and Hekate rest in the most archaic stratum of mythology in the fact that Iphigenia belongs to both of them. Also in Homer, we see one appearance of Artemis that stresses her warlike connections over and beyond the mere hunt in the wilderness. She appears in a massive dispute of the gods over the outcome of the Trojan War, and decisively supports the Trojans, upbraiding her brother Apollo for refusing to fight against their Poseidon. In this scene, Artemis is verbally thrashed by Hera, who sides with the ancient Greeks, and no more comes of it. But it's interesting that in this tale, Artemis performs almost a martial function. As already mentioned, as a leader of nymphs, Artemis, like Apollo, is also an overseer of dance and song, but mostly for girls. Indeed, dances of young girls, particularly when on the cusp of marriage, are very common in Artemis cult. Her most famous festival, covered more in the textbook, was the Broronia at Braron. The Artemision in Ephesus was her most famous temple. And in statuary and myth, she's often depicted as the chief goddess of the Amazons. In this representation, like in the Iliad, more fully a war goddess, like Athena. By later times, Artemis became syncretized to many other deities, of course Eileithyia, and also Cybele, in her function of mistress of the animals. And she's even closely connected to Bendis, a goddess which the Athenians only adopted in classical times. In fact, the first Spendia festival in the port of Athens is where Plato's Republic begins. Only much later does Artemis become associated with the moon goddess Selene or Hekate, as we see in Orphic fragment 356. The Orphic hymn to Artemis associates her especially with the god Dionysus and with the Titans, her mother being Leto. Why would Artemis and Dionysus be very closely related? Because both are frenzy-loving, mountain-haunting, bloodthirsty, and savage, and both love the ecstatic revel. This association of Artemis and Dionysus is actually very early, and we read in a Pindar fragment about how Artemis joined the divine Theosos or troupe of Dionysus as a Maenad. Exploring rural Greece today, it is not that uncommon to come upon smaller temples to the goddess Artemis and Apollo, often side by side. Here's a bird's-eye view of the valley in which the village of Pandrosos is set today. In archaic times, this was known as Lilaia. And here you see our guide who grew up in the village of Pandrosos, pointing out to us the way to a sacred cave in the mountains above. Very nearby the village, ruins with stones of various periods still stand, and were thought to be originally, on the one hand, a small temple to the goddess Artemis, and on the other, to the god Apollo. The archaeological remains are hard to read here, because only some of the stones are from the ancient world, but we can wonder whether it was common in Greek villages to have smaller temples, perhaps one-room schoolhouses, devoted respectively to Artemis and Apollo in their role as nurturers of youth. Is this what education looked like in the ancient world in a small Greek village like Lilaia, or were these originally two sacred sanctuaries, although small in size? Hard to say, but we'll be returning with our excellent guide, Panagiotis Lagos, in the next lecture on Apollo and to his tour of the regions around Delphi. I just wanted to introduce him to you as a figure in our course and give you a heads up that we'll be meeting him more next week. The Orphic hymn to Artemis is a rich source for her mythic associations. Hear me, O Queen, Zeus's daughter of many names, Titanic and Bacchic, reverend, renowned archer, torch-bearing goddess bringing light to all, Dictina, helper at childbirth. You aid women in labor, though you don't know what labor is. O frenzy-loving huntress, you loosen girdles and drive cares away. Swift, arrow-pouring, you love the outdoors and you roam at night. Fame-bringing, affable, redeeming, nurturer of mortal youths, immortal and yet of this earth, you slay wild beasts, O blessed one, and your realm is in the mountain forests. You hunt deer, O august and mighty queen of all, fair blossom, eternal, sylvan, dog-loving, many-shaped lady of Sidonia. Come, dear goddess, as savior, accessible to all the initiates, and bring earth's fair fruits and lovely peace and well-tressed health, and do banish disease and pain to the mountain peaks. Here Apollo and Artemis are called Titan because their mother was Leto. Only when they prove themselves or petition to Zeus does Hera's wrath against Leto and her children get quelled. Both Apollo and Artemis becoming Olympian deities at this point. Dictina is the Cretan goddess, often the form that Artemis takes in earlier Crete, and may be a background source for Rilke's Cretan Artemis. The maiden Dictina is said in myth to have been so antithetical to amorous attentions from the king Minos that she threw herself into the sea but was rescued in the net of fishermen, and hence her name means something like Lady of the Nets. Alternatively, her name may go back to Mount Dicte, and this is what Lady of Sidonia refers to in the hymn. Weirdly here, although virginal, Artemis loosens girdles of her maidens at the time of their wedding. Most essentially, she is nocturnal, masculine, a kruotrophos, or youth nurturer, as well as a savior, soter. As the fair blossom, eternal, sylvan, or dog-loving goddess, she's even associated with peace, health, and healing. Maybe having something to do with the well-being that time spent in nature brings to human beings. While not perfect, Otto's chapter on Artemis is one of the most succinct and systematic chapters written on this goddess. Again, it starts off on a relative low note, although we've roasted Otto enough already for his masculine versus feminine analyses. For Otto, starting off a bit from the male perspective here, although Artemis is generally a woman's goddess, Artemis represents the freedom of divine feminine nature. Again, uncanny, guiltless purity, maternity, and cruelty. Like in the Orphic hymn in Otto, Artemis appears most uncannily in the healing power of solitary nature. And this is why scholars, still in Otto a bit male-parsed here, find in Artemis peace and wholesome air, the awe with which earlier generations more intimately entered into silent valleys and hills. Otto goes on to sing a hymn to Artemis as a goddess of nature, like in Heidegger, but here it's more the sublime nature worshipped by men, especially by romantics. For Otto here, Artemis seems to be a goddess of the luminous moment when suddenly the form appeared, a god or a goddess, now like a man, now nearer to the monstrous, like an animal. Geez, Otto, he goes on, the solitudes of nature possess geniuses of diverse form, from the fearful and wild to the shy spirit of sweet maidenhood. But the loftiest of all is the encounter with the sublime. And here for Otto, Artemis becomes the divine spirit of sublime nature. The lofty, shimmering mistress, the pure one who compels delight and yet cannot love. The dancer and huntress who fondles cubs in her bosom and races the deer. Who brings death when she draws her bow, reserved and unapproachable like wild nature, and yet also like nature, holy enchantment and fresh excitement and lightning beauty. This is Artemis, Otto averes. Again, Otto has it out for Philomovitz, who claimed that Artemis is another goddess who arrived from non-Greek Asia Minor. And again, Otto isn't having it. We can imagine him saying, "Nah, dog, in my Homer, the goddess is wholly and genuinely Greek." Despite these stumbles, Otto's language and hymn to Artemis is at times also very apropos. In Euripides' play Hippolytus, Artemis utters her irrefragable hatred for the goddess of love, and he notes how, besides Artemis, only Persephone is honored with the epithet Hagne, pure, holy, or wild in Homer. He next cites an unforgettable scene in the Odyssey, where forth upon the mountains of Taygetus and Erymanthus goes the huntress Artemis to hunt wild boars or deers, and the wood nymphs, daughters of Aegis-bearing Zeus, take their sport along with her. Then is Leto proud at seeing her daughters stand a full head taller than the others, eclipsing the loveliest amidst a whole bevy of beauty. In Aeschylus's Agamemnon, we see cutesy animal-loving Artemis lamenting over a pregnant hare or rabbit who the eagles have gutted. Quote, "For well she loves the tender cubs of ravening lions, and well the suckling of every beast of the wood. Next to the lion, the bear was her favorite, then the stag. In fact, most all wild beasts are mentioned in connection with her, although she might protect them in one myth and hunt them down and sacrifice them in another." Nocturnally for Otto, Artemis brandishes the torches of the brilliant blaze with which she storms through the mountains of Lycia, and so is the goddess who roves by night, with her gleaming torches. On the theme of human sacrifice in Artemis cult, Otto mentions not only Iphigenia, but a temple of Artemis Aristobule in Melite that is in the western suburbs of Athens, where criminals were executed in her name, and also where the nooses of suicides were disposed of. Throughout her myths, Artemis might arouse madness in human beings, but she can also heal it, and she is sometimes prayed to bring gentle death and an end to endless suffering with her arrows. Although daughters might be sent to a local temple under the protection of Artemis for their sustenance or education, mature or older women often feared her as she might bring infant mortality or an early death. Homer said of Artemis, Zeus made her a lion among women and let her kill them whenever she chooses. Her withdrawn aloofness was also emphasized in the Orphic hymn, helper of pains or labors whom no pain or labor touches. The poet Callimachus seems to be Rilke's source for the closing lines of his poem. Upon the mountains I choose to dwell and mingle amongst city folk, only when women in the anguish of travail call upon my help. Iphigenia's tomb was said to be within the sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron, and to this tomb was dedicated the clothing of women who had died in childbearing. Having begun his chapter with how Artemis appears from the male perspective, Otto does acknowledge that she's the sovereign lady of women, holding a mighty power over womankind. And as to her relation to children, this is most essentially expressed in her epithet Kurotrophos, which we also saw in the Orphic hymn, nurse of children, or youth-nurturing deity. And her rituals and festivals in connection with her kurotrophic powers are many. On her function as a healing goddess, this also goes back to Homer, where Artemis with Leto tends to and heals the wounded Aeneas. Despite the cringiness of some of Otto's waxing eloquent about Artemis, his conclusion is really stunning. Artemis is the dancer in flower-decked meadows, the huntress of mountains, but moves also in the affairs of men. However, among men she remains the mercurial queen of solitude, terrifying and glorious, life and death-bringing. Pindar also sings how on the fabulous island of Syria there is no sickness, For when men grow old, Apollo of the silver bow and Artemis strikes them with their gentle shafts. We can very much detect Heidegger's source when Otto defines Artemis and Apollo as a near remoteness or arriving withdrawal and stately aloofness. Otto helpfully underlines here that Artemis's ideal of physical existence differs from Apollo's will to clarity and form. Apollo pursues spiritual freedom, Artemis, nature and its elemental freshness, mobility, and development. In conclusion, she is life and being, starry bright, sparkling, blinding, mobile, whose strangeness draws man on the more irresistibly, the more disdainfully it dismisses him. An essence crystal clear which is entwined with the dark roots in all animate nature. Pretty impressive sum up of the goddess Artemis there, Otto. And he concludes in this same fabulously long Germanic sentence that Artemis is childish yet incalculable, sweetly amiable yet diamond hard, girlishly demure, fleeting elusive, and suddenly brusque and contrary, playful, frolicking, dancing, and in a flash most inexorably serious. Lovingly anxious and tenderly solicitous, with the enchantment of a smile that outweighs perdition, and yet wild to the point of gruesomeness and cruel to the point of repulsiveness. In short, Artemis is free, withdrawn nature, pious, intuitive spirit, and the most divine perceptiveness of the most sublime femininity. So that being Otto's impassioned writing on the goddess of nature, Artemis, we can note next how Otto's chapter appears to studiously avoid most every Artemis myth that most people are familiar with. Why? Probably because Otto wants us to understand the Homeric essence of this goddess first, and because many of her most famous myths, although told in the archaic and classical period, come down to us in relatively complete form only in the later Ovid. Either that or they are star or place myths and so associated not so much with the traditional mythology of the Greeks, but rather with its redeployment in later astrological and etiological speculations. Our textbook chapter briefly covers some of the most famous myths associated with Artemis, those of Niobe, Actaeon, Callisto, Orion, and Arethusa, and I'll just be skimming lightly over them here. Niobe, the queen of Thebes, had her children slaughtered by Artemis and Apollo when she boasted that she was more worthy of worship than Leto. Actaeon, a hunter descendant of Cadmus, was turned into a stag and feasted upon by his own hunting dogs after accidentally seeing Artemis bathing with her nymphs. Callisto, a dedicated follower of Artemis, who was kissed by Zeus taking the form of Artemis, then raped, then expelled by Artemis, then Hera turned her into a bear, then Arcas, her own son by Zeus, almost killed her 15 years later, before Zeus finally took pity and intervened, turning them both into constellations. This myth is particularly interesting in regards to possible lesbianism among the nymphs of Artemis. Another very famous tale has Orion, the amorous hunter and giant, trying to rape Artemis while performing his labors, and who the goddess stings to death by inventing the scorpion, and Orion also becomes a constellation. Lastly, Arethusa, the Artemision nymph loved by the river god Alpheus, was covered by Artemis in a cloud to help make good her escape. But alas, Artemis couldn't prevent Arethusa in cloud form from merging with Alpheus's streams underground, and she eventually emerged, becoming a fountain. All these tales are extensively retold not only in Ovid, and they can all have very deep cross-cultural and cross-historical meanings, and they're also constantly re-envisioned in the history of Western art. I'll also be skipping here Artemis's famous Proronia festival, about which much is known and debated in classical studies. Most famously, this involved maidens' coming-of-age rites of passage and involved their wearing bear costumes and journeying underground, and these were secret ceremonies forbidden to men. Lastly, the longest part of our textbook chapter gives us great analyses and most of the key speeches in Euripides' Hippolytus, especially Aphrodite and Artemis in their feud. Artemis appears at the end in a veritable deus ex machina to set things right, and the textbook also covers the history of literary recreations of this legend. And there's also the topic of Artemis and misandry, Artemis and the Amazons, and Artemis and lesbianism, which any complete account of Artemis would need to more carefully explore. Alas, to keep the size of this lecture manageable, I'll be skipping all this neat stuff so that we have time to address one of the most influential topics of all in the study of Artemis, her possible relation to, similarities and differences from, Selene and Hekate. Okay, so welcome to part 2 of this lecture, Artemis, Selene, and Hekate. Why have these three goddesses become so intimately associated, to wit, as the three phases of the moon? Selene being the crescent or new moon, Artemis the full moon, although there is often confusion about this and interchangeability, and Hekate being the balsamic or waning moon. These three identifications are not really Greek, although we do hear in Servius about Selene in heaven, Artemis on earth, and Hekate in the realm of Hades. Most commonly, thinking of Artemis, Selene, and Hekate as the triple goddess or Maiden-Mother-Crone is extremely proverbial in contemporary magical circles and popular culture. And it is easy to see why waxing, waning, and reborn each month, the moon could become a supreme symbol of change, of women's mysteries and menstruation, and even a soft-focused, syncretized triple goddess. Next time you're awake to a new crescent moon, look up and think Selene. Or a bright full moon, think Artemis, or a balsamic or new moon, think Hekate. It's easy to imagine that neo-pagans are onto something here. By the 5th century BCE, there's some evidence of synthesizing Artemis and Selene. And by Hellenistic and Roman times, Hekate was added to the mix, although, like Artemis, herself a non-lunar goddess. In order to parse out these three goddesses more carefully, and gain some insight into who Selene really was, I'll be looking here into a book by Steve Moore, a truly astonishing hybrid work of dedication and profound scholarship. His Selene, the Moon Goddess and the Cave Oracle, completed the year he died in 2014 but published only in 2019. Moore rigorously demonstrates that while there may be religious, philosophical, symbolic, or magical reasons to syncretize these three goddesses, there is virtually no mythological basis to do so. As to a little background on Steve Moore and his amazing book, we might point out first that he was kind of like the Hobbit of Shooters Hill, London. A deep esotericist, he made his living as a writer of comic books and novels. Although he was also a definite expert in Greco-Roman mythology and in Taoism. He died in 2014, just after his greatest hymn to Selene and Gift to Humanity was completed. Only those who knew him would have guessed that this autodidact and writer of comic books was also the world's foremost authority on the goddess Selene. Moore didn't just study Selene, however. His home was a kind of selenium, and he dream incubated the goddess Selene over innumerable volumes of lucid dream journals. The guy was basically, even more than Keats or other poets, the most accomplished modern Endymion. Moore starts out this work by setting his sights firmly on the triple goddess idea in contemporary neo-paganism. And he notes there is no narrative strand involved in making an identification of Selene and Artemis. The mythological stories told of Artemis remain resolutely non-lunar, no matter how much she might be said to represent the moon. In fact, identifications of the two are late and distorting, and have even led to the notion that Selene is a virginal goddess, which is totally untrue. The idea of a triple moon goddess got going in the 20th century on account of the misleading work of Robert Graves, whose interpretations, quote, range from the idiosyncratic to the idiotic. There simply was no triple moon goddess for the ancient Greeks, since the Greeks didn't even divide lunar cycles into three, but rather into only two portions, rising and waning. Furthermore, while Demeter appears once as a mature maidservant, and while there are triple-form monsters such as the Griae, there are simply no ugly or aged goddesses in Greek myth. So the identification of Hekate with the crone is as well suspect. Most importantly, the definition in Servius of a triple-faced Diana Hekate, consisting of celestial Luna, terrestrial Diana, and chthonic Proserpina or Persephone, is a functional and a spatial arrangement, and has nothing to do with the maturation from youth to old age. Quite simply, the triple moon goddess idea as Mother Maiden-Crone is a modern fictional construction. Moore clarifies that there's nothing wrong if a 21st century person wants to worship a triple moon goddess, but that there is everything wrong if they delude themselves into thinking this corresponds in any significant respect to the ancients. According to Moore, this idea of a triple moon goddess became such a powerful modern idea precisely because it's a monolithic construction. Indeed, in all monolithic theories of myth strictly applied, structuralism, Jungian archetypes, Dumézil's trifunctional hypothesis, Marxism, feminism, etc., evidence tends to be arranged to fit the interpretation, and what results is a construction. In the case of the triple moon goddess, this construction arose very gradually. First, Bachofen posited an originally matriarchal society, but actually he confused matrilineal descent with matriarchal rule. In any case, Bachofen's originary matriarchy gets fused with Friedrich Engels' Marxism, and then filtered by way of the erratic Robert Graves into modern feminism. In the process, massive bodies of evidence are ignored or distorted. For example, the moon is hardly a universal symbol of menstruation or of women's mysteries in global myth. Often, the lunar deity is masculine. This is not to say there aren't many goddesses in Greek myth who are particularly concerned with women's interests. Eileithyia, Hera, and Artemis are three great examples of women's goddesses. But importantly, Selene is ever absent on these lists, and she barely shows up in women's festivals such as the Thesmophoria. The triple moon goddess idea has become so ubiquitous as a symbol of lunar mysteries or the triformal moon. And this despite the fact that most practitioners of this magical tradition can't even agree on the positions held by each of these three goddesses except for Hekate. To really understand Selene, or Hekate for that matter, we have to suspend the idea that these are the two other faces of a triple moon goddess and look at what the sources actually say. So let's look first to the Homeric hymn to Selene. Recall how in Hesiod, Selene was the daughter of Hyperion, the one above or transcender, and of Thea, whose name simply means goddess. And she usually drives a chariot like her brother Helios. The very charming Homeric hymn to Selene sings Muses, sweet-speaking daughters of Zeus Cronades, and mistresses of song, sing next of the long-winged moon. From her immortal head a heaven-sent glow envelops the earth, and great beauty arises under its radiance. From her golden crown the dim air is made to glitter, as her rays turn night to noon. Whenever bright Selene, having bathed her beautiful skin in Oceanus, puts on her shining raiment and harnesses her proud-necked and glistening steeds, swiftly driving them on their long-maned play with the evening and dividing the months. Her great orbit is full as she waxes, a most brilliant light appears in the sky. Thus to mortals she is a sign and a token. Once Cronades, Zeus shared her bed and her love, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Pandia, a maiden outstanding for beauty among the immortal gods. Hail, queen and white-armed goddess, splendid Selene, kindly and fair-tressed. Beginning with you, I shall sing of the glories of the demigods, whose deeds are ennobled by bards, who sing the muses with their lovely mouths. This Homeric hymn in fact gives us the most complete iconography of this goddess, stressing her great beauty. But calling Selene long-winged is an oddity we find only very rarely elsewhere. Selene's appearance is meticulously sung. She wears a crown, stephane, or diadem, which has the greatest depth at its center and narrows at the back of the head, kind of like a crescent moon. She is golden in the Homeric hymn, and calling Selene golden or silver is equally common in all the sources. The fact that her crown, clothing, and white arms all gleam suggests that she is shining from all parts of her body. Unlike her brother Helios, Selene begins her journey from west to east, which corresponds to her western rise on the third day of the lunar month. She emerges from some secret locale beyond the streams of Oceanus, or just at their edge, a region sung as the land of dreams in Homer's Odyssey. And before her rising, she ever takes a ritual bath, which emphasizes her holiness and sanctity, much like the Muses take a ritual bath in Hesiod's Theogony. Moore compares Selene's bathing, her dressing, her attributes, and her retinue to many other goddesses who go through a ritual of putting on their powers in myth. The child of Selene and Zeus is Pandia, whose name means the all-luminous, although this goddess is hardly mentioned elsewhere, and in many places comes to reflect simply Selene's own brightness. Most interestingly in the hymn, Selene is to mortals a sign, tekmor, or a pledge, sema. Probably what the poet is thinking here is that Selene is not only a reliable source of nocturnal light, but also an excellent calendrical indicator, the Greek calendar being lunar. And the poet might also be thinking that Selene is a source of omens and portents in divination. As to other myths of Selene's origin, the Homeric hymn to Helios gives us a contradictory genealogy. There, Helios, Selene, and Eos, the dawn, are all children of Hyperion and Euryphassa, whose name means far-shining. Yet another variant in the Homeric hymn to Hermes has Selene as the daughter of Lord Pallas, Megamedes' son. Euripides will eventually make Selene a daughter of Helios, again with no mention of the mother. Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE gives us Selene's strangest origin myth, saying that she goes back to the lost civilization of Atlantis. This myth is extremely euhemeristic, imagining as it does that all the main Greek gods were originally kingly or queenly mortals. According to this tale, the first king of Atlantis was Uranos, and his queen was Basileia, who was later called Gaia. After the king died, Basileia married Hyperion, her second husband, and that's how Helios and Selene were born. Helios was drowned and Selene threw herself from a roof in grief. After searching for them in grief, a lot like Demeter searching for Persephone, Basileia receives a vision that they have both been immortalized as the holy fires of sun and moon. And this was when the moon started to be called Selene rather than the earlier Mene, which is the other Greek name for the moon. Although she was pleased to receive this oracle, Basileia was also gripped by a sacred madness. She became obsessed with children's playthings, such as kettle drums or cymbals, and in herself became Rhea Sibylle, wandering the countryside in ecstatic ritual and eventually disappearing into a lightning storm. In another very charming myth in Claudian, we hear about Tethys as the foster mother of both Helios and Selene. The poet Claudian writing beautifully how Tethys affords the baby sun and moon a cradle, and soothes in her bosom their infant sobs. The rosy light of her foster children irradiates her dark blue plains, Tethys, you recall, being a goddess of the sea, and this referring to the exceptional augmentation of the beauty of the light of sun and moon when it reflects off the ocean. On Tethys' right shoulder, she carried the infant Titan Helios, too young as yet to vex with his light, and his encircling beams not yet grown. That's really very cute. Helios here being pictured as more gentle in those tender years, and from his baby mouth issued a soft flame that accompanied his infant cries. If that wasn't cute enough, we hear next that the moon was carried on Tethys' left shoulder, where she suckles the milk of that bright breast, her baby forehead being marked with a little horn. If anyone is planning to do a painting for their creative project, I would really love it to see someone recreate this scene of don't miss the soft flames of the belching baby Helios, or the little horn of the moon on Selene's forehead. As to other major myths of Selene, we hear in the poet Alcman, already in the 7th century BCE, Selene is the mother not only of Pangaea, but also with Zeus of Ersa, the dew, brightness and dew being her two most essential attendants. Much later, she appears as the mother, again with Zeus of the seasons, or Horai, suggesting a connection between her and Themis. In the 5th century CE Dionysian poet Nonnus, Selene is the mother of Narcissus with Endymion, and she is sometimes also the mother of the nymph Nemea or even of the Nemean lion. Most importantly, she's a central goddess in Orphism, where she appears quite early as the mother of both Musaeus, with either Eumolpus or Orpheus, and also as the mother or patron goddess of the philosopher and incubation cosmologue, that is compiler of cave oracles, Epimenides. In many Roman and some Greek myths, Selene is seduced by Pan. While most commentators agree this tale is impious, some find deep meaning in it. Of course, her most famous myth concerns her love for the handsome youth and shepherd Endymion. However, we lack a major retelling of this myth, probably because it was so well known, the details often being passed over. One of the most explicit versions of this tale we get from Pseudo-Heraclitus. Pseudo because scholars doubt this is the real philosopher Heraclitus. Quote, regarding Endymion and Selene, it is said that while he was sleeping, Selene fell in love with him and coming down slept with him. Endymion would have been a shepherd without experience of women. A woman holding fast to him in her desire, when asked who she was, replied, Selene. This doesn't really sound like Heraclitus, it must be admitted. In some versions of the myth of Selene and Endymion, Endymion sleeps in a cave throughout the romance. In others, he is a conscious lover. Our textbook notes that there are many variants to this story, but in all the outcome is the same. Zeus grants Endymion perpetual sleep with perpetual youth, a kind of opposite figure of Tithonus. At the end of some versions of the myth, Endymion is awoken, deified, and ascends to Olympus. In fact, we get a version of this as early as Hesiod, when he tells us that Endymion was transported by Zeus into heaven, but there he fell in love with Hera, compare Ixion, who befooled him in the shape of a cloud and was cast out and went down into Hades. The variants of Endymion's tale are legion and bewildering in our sources, and one really needs to read Steve Moore's book very carefully to sort them all out. It does seem that the myth of Selene and Endymion is closely related to Aphrodite's seduction of the mortal shepherd Anchises, and Selene's sister Eos, the Dawn, whose most common epithets are rosy-fingered and saffron-robed, is also, like Selene, a highly amorous goddess. Her relationship to Tithonus is a parallel to Selene's with Endymion. The difference between Eos and Selene seems to be that Eos is almost nymphomaniac, whereas Selene seems to have fewer mortal and immortal lovers of higher quality. Why did the Greeks think of Eos, the dawn, as sex-crazed? In Apollodorus, we hear a myth explaining this, wherein a vengeful Aphrodite causes Eos to be perpetually in love with someone after she caught her sleeping with Ares. Accordingly, there are many more myths of her lovers, and she frequently abducts mortal men. Selene seems to do this only once, with Endymion. Her romance with Pan being mostly non-consensual, with Pan as the amorous pursuer. On the interesting topic of Endymion's name, Moore takes Robert Graves and Carl Karenyi to task here. Graves says the meaning of Endymion is seduced native. The name Endymion, from Enduine, or Latin inducere, refers to the moon's seduction of the king, as though she were one of the Empusae, and the ancients explain this by referring to the sleep put upon Endymion. This is highly misleading, and Moore proceeds to strip away the embellishments. Graves is correct when he says that Endymion goes back to the Greek root enduo, meaning to put on, to wear, to go in, to enter, or to implicate oneself in. But he notes how Graves confuses this Greek etymology with the Latin root induco, which means more to bring in, to lead, to induce, to persuade, to introduce, or even to seduce. What Graves has done here, according to Moore, is a bait and switch. He mentions the Greek enduine, but his etymology proceeds from the Latin inducere. He then reads induction as seduction, and compares Selene to a demonic succubus-like being known as an empusae. Moore's takedown on this is absolutely brilliant. Quote, "If ancient goddesses could sue dead authors, one would rather expect a libel case in the hereafter." Graves' interpretation starts from false premises and results in a completely unjustified conclusion. Ouch, utterly scathing. Moore goes on to note how Karenyi's definition of Endymion as one who finds himself within does stick with the Greek enduo, but the overall tone here is one of Jungian self-discovery, or the integration of the beloved anima, Selene, in the self, Endymion. The problem with this etymology in Karenyi is it imports Jungian assumptions, and implies that Endymion doesn't exist independently of his relationship to Selene, Endymion and Selene being two sides of a single archetypal complex. For Moore, to avoid this pitfall, the name Endymion can be more correctly translated in the descriptive mode simply as the one within, and what this points to ultimately is the close connection between the myth of Endymion and incubatory cave ritual. Later on, when Moore does address the meaning of this myth in an archetypal or mythical mode, he notes more sparsely that the story of Endymion and Selene represents an ultimate intercourse on the part of a mortal man with the deity of night and of dreams. Selene and Nyx and Selene and Onoiros being very often thought together in our sources. Through his union with Selene, the sleeping Endymion gains a knowledge which is, in the physical and biblical sense of the word, a knowing of Selene, and this even if Endymion's part in the process often appears to be entirely passive. This myth is about knowledge gained through dreams and through vision, and which comes from the unconscious level, represented by caves, the underworld, and liminal areas in general. For Moore, the knowledge granted to Endymion by Selene is lunar or imaginative knowledge, and in this it is much unlike the rational solar knowledge represented by the Apollonian tradition. The story of the philosopher cosmologue Epimenides seems to represent the same thing on a somewhat less exalted level. Epimenides, after all, leads a legendary life with a legendary knowledge, but the time of his incubation is set to a period of 40 years, and in the end he's a mortal man and an historical figure, unlike the mythical Endymion. And so if we think of Endymion as a mortal come god of dream incubation, and Epimenides as someone who lives his myth in life and legend, on the level below this, we have the human individuals who are always consulting dream oracles. These ordinary individuals who visit a cave or dream sanctuary associated with Selene are in quest of the same lunar variety of knowledge that arises from the unconscious through dream. And so, in short, for Moore, the Selene and Endymion story is about dream oracles, and what it establishes in ritual and religion is a mythical archetype and a functioning rationale for dream interpretation. Much evidence about Endymion as a recipient of dreams and Selene as a sender of dreams follows. Another important topic in Moore's book we should cover briefly is the distinction between Selene and Mene as names for the moon. Much debate exists over the meaning of this fact that Selene has two names, and scholars aren't quite sure which of these words or parts of these words are Greek or pre-Greek. The name Selene might come from Silos, a Greek word meaning brightness. Ene part of her name, however, is either a Greek or a pre-Greek word. It comes to denote basically the feminized ending. but the question of its origins, Greek or pre-Greek, remains open. And Moore notes beautifully that here etymology provides only glimpses of possibility, as fleeting as moonlight in the darkness of antiquity. Unlike Selene, the word Mene or Mene, from the feminized men meaning moon or month, does appear in one linear beat tablet as a name for the moon, Mene. Sometimes this is thought to imply that Mene was a Cretan goddess of the moon and Selene the Greek goddess. Here again, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. For it could well be that Selene was named alongside Mene before the arrival of the Greeks. Carl Karenyi suggests that Mene is the physical moon and Selene the goddess herself, which may seem tempting, although there's no evidence for it. In fact, both names were used interchangeably in archaic and classical times to name either the satellite or the goddess. It even seems at times that poets choose to name the moon goddess Selene, a trisyllabic word, or Mene, a disyllabic word, based on purely metrical considerations in a given poem. Careful listeners will remember that Diodorus had argued that the moon was first called Mene and later Selene after the suicide of Basileia, but Moore notes correctly that this source is both late and archaizing. Maybe the most helpful fragment we have in sorting out the difference of Mene and Selene in Greek myth and thought is Orphic Fragment 91, which comes down to us from the lost Orphic Rhapsodies. Quote, "And he contrived another vast earth. Selene the immortals call it, but men on earth, Mene. Many mountains it has, many cities, many halls." The incomparable Martin L. West dates this fragment to around the 4th century BCE, i.e. quite early. But he notes the distinction made between gods and men's names for the moon has no religious significance, but is a poetic mannerism. While I'm sure West would win any debate on more or less any academic subject he writes about, I'm actually not so sure about his reading of this Orphic fragment here. Moore seems to accept it playfully at face value. Once again, all becomes moonlight and shadows, with nothing definite to grasp at. I would rather underline here something that M.L. West talks about in his book on Indo-European poetry, namely that poetic inventories of what the gods name things versus what mortals name things is properly a feature of Indo-European poetic language, and thus goes very, very far back and might not be here in the Orphics merely a mannerism. The Elder Edda gives us our best example of this, with its massive inventory of what all the most major deities and places are named, not only by men, but also by gods in hell, by giants, dwarves, or elves. Moon by men, the ball by God, the whirling wheel in hell, the speeder by giants, the bright one by dwarves, by elves the tally of years. Of course, this Orphic fragment alone doesn't give us enough evidence to say that the Orphics had a similar tradition. But there are several examples of this in the Orphic hymns. And we've already cited one in Pindar earlier in this lecture, Pindar himself being reputed to have had Orphic initiation. In the end, Moore is probably right to be more cautious here. But we might add that if there is a religious meaning, in Fragment 91 only an Orphic initiate could say. The moon is described as having mountains, cities, halls, perhaps distant to men who call her Mene, but seen by the gods, another vast earth, who call her Selene. And perhaps the Orphics in their visionary theosis or henosis becoming one with the gods see this Selene as well. Next up, and sometimes thought by scholars to be also of Orphic provenance, we have the Endymion sarcophagi from the later Hellenistic and Roman worlds, currently housed in the New York Metropolitan. The number of myths and details that deck out this sarcophagi would take a whole lecture to explore. This sarcophagi may be associated with Roman Orphism during the period, although I'll be giving just the Greek names here. Very briefly, we see here the encounter of Selene and Endymion, as well as the nymphs, Helios, the morning star and evening star, or Venus, Oceanus, Eos, Selene, and Selene again, departing in her chariot at the end of the night. And there are similar scenes on the other side. We even see here the figures of Eros and Psyche under the lion's head embracing. Another image of true love and a doublet to the Selene and Endymion scene. In her main depiction with Endymion, and led on by her Erotes, Selene steps down from the rear of her chariot towards the sleeping Endymion, who lies in classic repose, reclining on his left elbow with his right arm thrown over his head, his cloak even being pulled away to reveal his naked body and genitalia. Clearly a sex scene, and he also seems to be related here to Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Nyx, god of the night. Many other gods are represented here, including the woodland god Sylvanus, the seasons spring and autumn, Aphrodite, Ares, Cupid, and Psyche, although we don't see a parallel scene of Dionysus waking up Ariadne on Naxos, which would have probably worked very well here. As to the existence of Selene in myth and cult, Parker notes in the Oxford Classical Dictionary how actual worship of Selene, as of Helios, is treated by Aristophanes as characteristic of barbarians in opposition to Greeks. What this probably really means is that Selene cult was far more prevalent in rural rather than urban areas. Certainly in her ritual and religious worship, Selene was not nearly as major a goddess as Artemis or Hekate, and there is remarkably little evidence of her cult worship. In fact, we find almost no temples of Selene, no great epics to her. There is some evidence, however, of how she was worshipped in cult, especially through wineless sacrifices, Nephalia emphasizing her purity, despite being far from virginal as we've seen, and also Melisponda, or libations of honey to Selene, appear very frequently in rural ritual. Selene does have many shrines within temples that are dedicated to other gods, and we hear of her especially in the great temple of Asclepius at Epidaurus, another incubation site of course, and we hear of one temple to Selene and Helios in Constantinople in later sources. Around this time, Porphyry speaks of an Arcadian cave that is dedicated to Selene and Pan. If we want archaeological confirmation of the moon goddess, in fact, the Etruscan Selene provides it more abundantly. Selene being associated with many healing springs, and bronze statues of her, along with evidence of her divinatory worship, being found in Etruscan territories as early as the 4th century BCE. In fact, you can still visit in Italy the Chiaciano Terme today, and it's still very often dedicated to the moon, as you can see here. Summing up his overall findings and directions for future research, Moore concludes by noting that our sources for Selene range across the astronomical, the genealogical, the oracular, and the funereal, and vary greatly based on historical periods and geographical locations. In all this quite substantial evidence, once it's all tallied up, there is, however, no evidence of her association with women's mysteries or a triple moon goddess. Whatever her meaning to ancient women was, we can only speculate. And when she does appear in a synchronized form with Artemis or Hekate, this is invariably the result of philosophical and religious speculation. In myth, Selene is the mother of Pandia or Herses, dew and moonlight. And like Helios, her brother, Selene is a visible deity, one of those gods you can actually see in the sky. But she might also have invisible or metaphysical associations, like in Orphism. Importantly, Selene doesn't live on Mount Olympus and doesn't even seem to be an Olympian. Rather, she is continually journeying across the sky and always being reborn, or at least rebathing at the outset of every journey, between the far west and the far east, rather than from east to west, and at the edge of Okeanos. While herself a descendant of Titans, she very importantly has no associations in the Titanomachy, or as part of the Olympian administration, except for her occasional couplings with Zeus. Again, her most major myths are those with Endymion, many versions in Pan, and the Endymion myth was very often rationalized or euhemerized by saying that Endymion was one of the first astronomers. In fact, the evidence points to her greatest importance being her association with dream oracles and the oracular traditions of the Cresmologues. Selene is particularly associated in Moore's book with the bedchamber rituals at Thalami. Alas, despite some tantalizing ritual and religious details, most of the evidence for this goddess is mythical, rather than ritually based. Mythically, Selene becomes the mother of Epimenides and of Musaeus, and here, as elsewhere, she's strongly connected to Orphic or Pythagorean traditions of lunar knowledge. It is in this context that Alexander of Abonoticus finally speaks of Selenic mysteries, and associates them with both the Orphics and the Pythagoreans, himself being a card-carrying member in the 2nd century CE. And so from all this, it seems likely that Selene was closely associated with the Orphic doctrine of salvation in the afterlife, and that we can call her a soter or savior goddess. And this may indeed be what the Endymion sarcophagi is all about. For Steve Moore, the most promising avenues for future research into Selene constellate around 3 basic areas. She is a goddess of dream oracles, of subterranean practices, and of unorthodox cosmologies. Concluding our treatment of the goddess here, let's read the Orphic hymn to Selene, to be performed to aromatic herbs. Hearken, O divine queen, light-bringing and splendid Selene, bull-horned moon traversing the air in a race with night, nocturnal, torch-bearing maiden of fair stars, moon waxing and waning, feminine and masculine, glittering lover of horses, mother of time, bearer of fruit, amber-colored, brooding, shining in the night, all-seeing, vigilant, surrounded by beautiful stars, you delight in quiet and in the richness of the night. Shining in the night like a jewel, you grant fulfillment and favor. Long-cloaked marshal of the stars, wise maiden whose motion is circular, come, blessed and gentle lady of the stars, in 3 ways shine your redeeming light upon your new initiates. In reflecting on the Orphic hymn to the moon, Athanassakis notes that Selene appears frequently in magical texts, like the Greek magical papyri, and despite Stephen Moore's admirable emphasis on the mythology and cult of the goddess Selene in isolation, the scholarly jury is still very much out of whether identifications of Hekate, Selene, and Artemis in Orphic sources and the Greek magical papyri is of an ancient pedigree or not. In this Orphic hymn, Selene is preceded by the stars and sun. Recall how in Orphic fragment 155, the moon was called another earth. Indeed, throughout the Orphic sources, the moon has chthonic associations despite being a celestial body. Here, Helene shares the epithet torchbearer with both Artemis, Demeter, and Hekate, and this as well corresponds to the magical papyri. Interestingly, for the Orphics, the moon is androgynous, like Physis or nature, as well as like Athena, Mise, or Adonis. Although we won't be getting into these 3 goddesses in the magical papyri here, we do find the moon evoked. I summon you, triple-faced goddess, moon, lovely light, Hermes, and Hekate together. It seems here the Orphic hymns are very close to the magical papyri. The Orphics also here call Selene the mother of time, just as Helios is called the father of time. And Athanassakis suggests this may be an integration of the demiurge idea in Plato's Timaeus, since there the demiurge is the one who creates the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars to fix and measure time. Lastly, Selene is here called the long-cloaked marshal of the stars, and again we hear something similar in the prayer to Selene in the magical papyri, where she is addressed as one who shares in the triple shapes of the triple graces, dancing with the stars in a festive revel. All this already raises serious questions about whether Moore's insistence on the archaic, mythological, and ritual purity of Selene versus the evidence for her religious and philosophical unity with Hekate or Artemis can be sustained or not. Can we really make such a sharp distinction between mythology, ritual, philosophy, and religion? In order to bring forth these 3 goddesses, Artemis, Selene, and Hekate in isolation? Our textbook glosses over this fascinating issue with barely any explanation, simply noting that as a moon goddess, Artemis is linked with Selene and her cousin Hekate. Hekate is then described as a fertility goddess of the underworld, depicted like a fury with a scourge and a blazing torch, and accompanied by fierce hounds. This is certainly one of her manifestations, but not, as we'll see, the only one. The textbook goes on to inform us that Hekate is a goddess of the crossroads, or trivia, a place thought to be the center of the ghostly activity of the dead of night. She is skilled in the arts of black magic and is often invoked by sorceresses from Medea to Lady Macbeth. Offerings of food made to her, often called Hecate's suppers, occurred at triple-faced statues, usually erected at crossroads, and which depicted the 3 aspects of the moon. Again, Selene, Artemis, and Hekate. That's all we get in this chapter, and it's not really very accurate, and so this leaves us to wonder who the heck Hekate was. And so welcome to the 3rd portion of this lecture, an introduction to the goddess Hekate, or Hekate, which you say being very much a matter of preference. And to start off with the goddess Hekate, we must at last return to this suspended and lingering issue in our otherwise complete treatment of Hesiod's theogony. Recall how Hesiod, after having given the cosmogony through to Uranos' castration and the birth of Aphrodite, and before singing of the myths associated with Kronos and Rhea, namely the myth of succession to Zeus, the 2nd full quarter of Hesiod's poem sings of Uranos' revenge, as well as the generations of dark deities from Chaos or Nyx, and from Gaia and Pontos, such as the monsters or the lighter sea nymphs. Before picking up the narrative of Zeus's rise to power, the next section, often overlooked, is the 40-line long hymn to Hekate. What this means in terms of Hesiod's poem is that Hekate is the liminal point or bridge between the Titans and the Olympians, and she also plays a pivotal role in Zeus's victory in the Titanomachy and the Gigantomachy. This is not, however, the reason why Hesiod holds her in such high esteem. Her prominence in Greek religion, from Hesiod alone we can say, clearly predates her involvement in the wars of Zeus. And so we are left to wonder the close relationship of Hekate and Zeus, which Hesiod clearly underlines, actually entailed. Here we can note that no other deity other than the Muses and Zeus received such a long individual treatment in Hesiod, and scholars have thus debated whether Hekate is a goddess to whom Hesiod was particularly dedicated, or whether more simply this hymn of his reflects merely her prominence at the time. Let's listen to Hesiod's hymn. The section concerning Hekate begins, Phoebe went to the much-longed-for bed of Koios, and she, a goddess loved by a god, conceived and gave birth to dark-robed Leto, ever sweet and gentle to men, and to the gods who never die, sweet from the beginning and gentlest of all the Olympians. Phoebe also bore Asteria, whose name brings good luck. Perses brought her to his great house to be his dear wife. There she conceived and bore Hekate, whom Zeus honored above all others. He gave her dazzling gifts, a share of the earth and a share of the barren sea. Very importantly, Hekate is not mentioned elsewhere in Hesiod's Theogony, although there's some testimony about her elsewhere in his fragments. And like Eros, she's not mentioned once in Homer, perhaps because of Homer's distaste for deities with a chthonic function. What Hesiod credits to Hekate is really astonishing. She has wide-ranging powers, or dazzling gifts from Zeus, including a share of the earth and a share of the barren sea. Later, Hesiod will give her domain in the sky as well. This massive domain implies that Hekate is powerful throughout earth and sea, also sky, and elsewhere, also in the underworld. Hesiod lavishes so much praise on Hekate that this piece is usually referred to as his hymn to Hekate. And before we read the rest of it, let's take a little quick look into what Hesiod has already told us about her family tree. On her grandfather's side, she's a descendant of Pontus and Gaia, and thus of Eurybia, the fierce mistress of the sea, and of Creos. On her mother's side, she's descended from Koios and Phoebe. These are three of the most obscure titans, and Eurybia, one of the most obscure children of Gaia and Pontus. And these are just her grandparents. More manageably, we hear that her mother is Asteria, a sister of Leto, and her father Perses, the destroyer, another obscure god. No wonder, just looking at this family tree, that her origins are often forgotten. On this lineage, Athanassakis underlines that there was an error in the Oxford Classical Dictionary, which made Hekate a daughter of Koios and Phoebe, and that this error passed into many handbooks of Greek mythology, and even into several translations. Who but experts in Greek mythology even talk about these gods, or Perses and Asteria, her parents? At the very least, however, we can observe that she is the first cousin of Artemis and Apollo. And indeed, she is equal to them in power and prominence across Greek religion, despite herself never being canonized as an Olympian goddess like Aphrodite. Sorita d'Este, in her amazing book on Hecate's mythology, argues that Hesiod is not some idiosyncratic devotee of her in this hymn, but acknowledges her great prominence. Moreover, the evidence indicates that she was frequently worshipped alongside the god Zeus, sometimes seemingly as his equal or companion. Hecate's mother, the goddess Asteria, is associated with divination by dreams, oneiromancy, and with the starry sky, falling stars, and divination by stars, or astrology. Asteria may have had her origins as an oracular goddess who was known as Brizo, slumber, and worshipped on the island of Delos and associated with dream oracles. Here again, the functions of Hekate and Selene overlap. There are many myths about the relationship of Zeus and Asteria, Hecate's mother, much more than we have space for here, but particularly noteworthy is that when Zeus failed to woo her, he turned his attention to Leto. As to who Perses is, often confused with Perses, father of Circe, we are mostly reliant on etymologies. All we can really say for certain is that his name meant the destroyer. Perses must have been powerful and interesting to succeed with Asteria where Zeus had failed. Again, at the very least, these entwined genealogies do serve to closely connect Hekate to both Apollo and Artemis. They are first cousins after all. Back to Hesiod's hymn to Hekate. After Zeus gives her dazzling gifts, a share of the earth and a share of the barren sea, we next hear that she was given a place of honor in the starry sky, and among the deathless gods her rank is high. For even now, when a mortal propitiates the gods and following custom, sacrifices well-chosen victims, he invokes Hekate, and if she receives his prayers with favor, then honor goes to him with great ease, and he is given blessings, because she has power and a share in all the rights once granted to the offspring born of Uranos and Gaia. The son of Kronos did not use force on her, and took away none of the rights she held under the Titans. Those older gods, the distribution made in the beginning is still the same, nor does the goddess have less honor for being an only child. In fact, she has much more because Zeus honors her, and her domain extends over land and sky and sea. And she can greatly aid a man if this is her wish. In trials, her seat is at the side of illustrious kings. In assemblies, the man she favors gains distinction. And when men arm themselves for man-destroying battle, the goddess always stands beside the one she prefers, and gladly grants them victory and glory. Here she appears for the first time as a goddess of sacrifices, and one who wields all the rights of Uranos and Gaia. What is even more astonishing, Zeus is powerless to force her to do anything, and cannot reduce her stature in any way. Hesiod doesn't exactly say that Zeus is beholden to Hecate's will, like he is to the Fates or Aphrodite, but close enough. Zeus has no power over her, so she is his equal, and the distribution of power, which Hekate received in the beginning, is still the same, which may even imply that Hekate does have some power over Zeus in certain context. Two things are certain here: Zeus honors her and never interferes. And as to her relationship to mortals, this is equally exceptional. Hekate can greatly aid a man if this is her wish, and this makes her ritually very close to human beings. It's been posited that this may be Hesiod's attempt to politicize an earlier chthonic goddess, and make her more fully a part of Zeus's new regime. Hekate even appears here as a war goddess who has the power to grant victory merely by her presence, standing beside whoever she prefers, a lot like Athena. How did these ways of characterizing Hekate get going, we might ask, in Hesiod? And also, how do we get from here to the tradition in which she is strongly associated with magic and superstition, and becomes more like a malevolent or dangerous demon with ghoulish and funereal associations? A very interesting story indeed. And if this wasn't enough, the hymn goes on to sing of how Hekate is a goddess who oversees athletic contest, and horsemanship and mariners alongside Poseidon and livestock. Interestingly, she is here and for the first time associated with Hermes, and when she wishes from the heart, she can be noble and with Hermes help livestock to breed in the stalls and swell or thin out herds of cattle. Later in the Orphic hymn, we'll hear again how she ever favors the ox herd. This very early connection to Hermes is particularly interesting, how close these two gods of liminality will eventually become. It could even be that although Hekate remains virginal, Hermes is the only real candidate to be her mate. And there have been rare speculations regarding how the sacred wedding or hydrogamy of Hekate and Hermes might be yet another one to add to our list, although strictly esoteric. Next, Hesiod's hymn repeatedly stresses that although Hekate is an only child, she is most honored, and the prayer to Hekate ends with calling her, like Apollo and Artemis, her closest cousins, a Kurotrophos, or nurturer of youth, and also one who draws youth into the light of wakeful dawn, Eos. What we don't hear in Hesiod is any direct connection of Hekate with Artemis or with Selene, rather at best only distant allusions. Athanassakis tends to think that Hecate's connection with magic and unappetizing sacrificial practices was very old and familiar to Hesiod, and so Hesiod, in his fervent devotion to the new ideals of Zeus's justice and collaborative social values, finds that it's necessary to civilize and bring the chthonic Hekate into Zeus's fold. Accordingly, for Athanassakis, the hymn to Hekate remakes an old goddess whose worship may have been rooted in primitive, regressive, or potentially harmful practices into a benign and powerful goddess who poses no threat to the new social order. Who Hekate was before Hesiod is thus understood by Athanassakis on the model of the Furies. Recall how in Aeschylus, the vindictive Furies were transformed into the benign Eumenides. This may be a fine analog of what's going on in Hesiod's hymn to Hekate. That's a definite theory, but one without evidence to support it, merely a speculation. To really figure out who Hekate was to Hesiod, we must first examine her many aspects and take into account all the evidence, even when later. And here I'll be turning to a summary of Soraya Deste's book. As we've seen, Hekate is not described as the wife of any of the gods, but she does seem ritually very close to Hermes as a deity of thresholds, boundaries, crossroads, underworld journeys, and liminal spaces. Her name from Hekatos we've seen already are epithets of Apollo and Artemis, and in this form the word means worker from afar. On rare occasion, Hekate is even depicted with a bow. According to Deste, her identification with Artemis may in fact precede their later conflation, Hekate being the larger goddess from which Artemis was separated and individualized. Alternatively, Hecate's name may come from Hekato, which means 100, as in the Greek hecatomb, or sacrifice of 100 cattle. Most importantly, and much like the goddess Athena, Hekate appears to be a maiden and a mother, Parthenos and Mater, and increasingly Mater, but never a crone. Pindar sings of her as the virgin with the red border, kindly Hekate, a messenger for the word that wants to come true. References to this goddess are so numerous throughout antiquity that she shows up in almost every conceivable context and function, like in Hesiod's hymn, which barely scratches the surface. Although they have different genealogies, she's often also closely associated with Cerce on account of her exceptional knowledge of magic or witchcraft, and Hekate is still very much a goddess of witches today, although the word witch itself is pretty problematic here, as we'll see. Hekate is named the teacher of her favorite priestess, Medea, in the Argonautica, and already in Apollonius of Rhodes, Hekate has her own temples and is called triformis, or triple-shaped. In some sources, Medea and Cerce are both called allegorically daughters of Hekate. Even Proclus sings to this goddess as many-named. Hail, many-named mother of the gods, whose children are fair. Hail, mighty Hekate, of the threshold or of the porch. According to Soraya Deste, we simply can't avoid the historical process whereby Hekate becomes syncretized with many, almost innumerable goddesses. In her association with Rhea Cybele, Hekate is often depicted alongside Hermes as the two messengers or lieutenants of the Great Mother. Her worship and symbols may even go back as far as the seated woman of Çatalhöyük, and this especially due to the association with bulls. The tragic poet Aeschylus in his Suppliants already has a chorus prayer to Artemis Hekate, who watches over the childbed of women. And from at least the 5th century BC onwards, Artemis and Hekate shared many epithets, especially Sotyra, the savior, Enodia of the crossroads, Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, Persea, the destroyer, Tauropolis, the controller of bulls, the maiden, the virgin, the light bringer, and the holy or pure. In Sophocles and Athenian cult and in Roman authors, Hekate and Artemis are syncretized with the Greek adoption of Bendis and later the Roman Bona Dea or good goddess. These are all torch-bearing goddesses associated with the spear, dogs, the underworld, magic, triple crossroads, and much else besides. The Orphic goddess of the underworld, Brimo, whose name means the terrifying, is often named alongside Persephone and may be another name for Hekate. In the Orphic gold leaves, Brimo is used as the name for a goddess, forming a trio with Demeter and Persephone. Hekate, as Brimo, is the third goddess who fulfills the Eleusinian Trinity, and the syncretisms of Hekate and other goddesses continue. Recall how Despoina, or Lady, an Arcadian goddess of fertility, sometimes said to be a daughter of Demeter with Poseidon. Guess what? No less an authority than Aeschylus once called her Despoina Hekate. And just as Artemis was becoming fused with the Roman Diana, Hekate associations only increased, since Artemis, Diana, and Hekate all came to be called Triformis and Trivia, triple-formed goddesses of the crossroads. Worship of Diana Artemis or Diana Hekate became very widespread, and it was in this form that Hekate and Artemis Diana spread throughout the British Isles and into modernity as goddess of witches, even as the original fairy queen. As early as the medical writer Hippocrates, Hekate Enoidia, or of the crossroads, became associated with nocturnal attacks of ghosts and of bad dreams, and under this name she was frequently named as being associated with the souls of the dead and with witchcraft. The gruesome sacrifices of which Athanassakis spoke involved dogs sacrificed to Enodia, and it's perhaps from Enodia that Hekate inherits her associations with dog sacrifice. As we've seen already from the 2nd century BCE, even the moon goddess Selene became syncretized with Hekate. In the Greek lyric fragments from this period, we find Artemis is Selene. These identifications are legion in the PGM or Greek magical papyri. Kotansky comments, no doubt much to Steve Moore's chagrin, that by the time of the Greek magical papyri, Artemis, Hekate, Selene, Mene, and Persephone were so intimately intertwined that any differentiation between them as archetypal moon goddesses became virtually impossible. Apuleius in his Golden Ass includes Hekate in a long list of goddesses identified with Isis, and Isis Hekate appears in the Roman period, both being especially associated with magic. The three faces of Hekate are also often associated with the three Erinyes or Furies. Both Hekate and the Furies hold torches, swords, whips, or serpents, and both are described as virgins, maidens, and unbribable. In the Chaldean oracles, Hekate is even identified with nature or Physis, with Hekate in the first place above Physis. Quote, boundless Physis is suspended from the back of the goddess, Hekate. Sorita d'Este notes that Hekate may have a claim to having more epithets than almost any other god or goddess, hundreds of them, this just being two lists of her most common. And as a many-named wandering goddess, from her earliest myths to the end of antiquity, as well as through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and modernity, night-wandering Hekate never really died or disappeared. Her origins were not only Hellenic, but ranged from Italy and Sicily to Anatolia, and she intersected marvelously with the lives of most all the greatest philosophers and poets, from our earliest sources to Christianity and then beyond. The most major sites for archaeological evidence of her cult, ritual, and legends include especially Minoan Crete and the island of Aegina near Athens. Scholars sometimes speculate that Hekate may have been the Cretan snake goddess, and perhaps originally fused with Athena and Artemis. And in Cretan mythology, she's particularly associated, like Artemis, with Dictina. Remember, the Cretan virgin who threw herself into the sea to avoid the advances of King Minos. On the island of Aegina near Athens, this same Dictina was also fabled to have been rescued by fishermen, hence Lady of the Nets, and her cult continues to this day in a temple to the goddess Apphia, the goddess of disappearance. Pausanias reports how the mystery rites performed in honor of Hekate on the island of Aegina are the deepest that there are, this being Hecate's island above all others. And he even says that Orpheus himself introduced these rituals on the island. Here you see on Aegina Aphia's temple and the sea view from her sanctuary, and her temple itself, one of the most ancient and best preserved in Greece. The 19th century believed this to be a temple to Zeus Panhellenicus, but it was later realized to be a temple of the goddess Apphia. Although because of Pausanias, the island of Aegina is particularly famous for Hekate worship, alas, less evidence survives for it here than elsewhere. The association of Aegina and the temple of Apphia with Hekate nevertheless persists, and many a traveler to the island was perhaps struck by a similar sign, as I was in 2019 when I visited here, and a face-down half-moon rose conspicuously over the temple. Sorita d'Este goes on in this part of her book to become a veritable tour guide for devotees of Hekate. If you're really into this goddess, you should visit several sites in ancient Caria or Anatolia, Clyduches or Hekate the Key-bearer, and much archaeological evidence exists here, including her first association with Agathos Daimon or the good Daimon, and with Zeus Panamoros, all-loving or even pansexual Zeus, who was here sung alongside Hekate. Evidence for Hekate worship and cult also exists in Antioch, at Ephesus, in Cyrene in North Africa, at Didyma, Miletos, Colophon, Colchis, Rhodes, Thera, Delos, Eleusis, Samothrace, Thessaly, Thrace, Lydia, Delphi, Neapolis, Kos, Argos, Italy, Sicily, Egypt, basically everywhere, especially Athens. And if all this stuff interests you, Sorita d'Este goes into all the evidence for each of these. Many Athenians spoke of the porches of Hekate, and Hekate herms been frequently discovered in the Agora. We can only scratch the surface here. In this course, we'll meet Hekate again when we study the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the Eleusinian mysteries. In that context, it is Hekate who hears Persephone's abduction and informs Demeter about it, and she is also present at the weeping, ecstatic reunion of mother and daughter, and seems to become Persephone's personal assistant in her descents and ascents. A topic that Sorita d'Este covers more lightly in this book is the important presence of Hekate in the Chaldean oracles, from which we have only surviving fragments. This was a revealed religious text attributed to Julian the Theurgist around the 1st or 2nd centuries CE that became the core text, some have said the Bible of Middle and Late Platonism. So Hekate is particularly important in the Platonic emphasis on theurgy, which we can translate as godcraft, and means compelling or encouraging the various gods to manifestation through good and natural magic. On this topic, D'Este writes that Hekate is the foremost goddess of the Chaldean oracles, which is a significant theurgic work emphasizing Hekate as being a sotyra or savior, and as a benevolent source of souls and of virtues. Hecate's place in the Chaldean oracles has been the subject of many lucid studies, primarily the books Hekate Sotyra by Johnston and the Goddess Hekate by Ronan, which you can see here on the left and are really worth picking up. As mentioned already, in the Chaldean oracles, Hekate is nature or Physis herself, and even the goddess of the world soul. As the oracles put this, the mistress of life, who holds the plenitude of the full womb of the cosmos. And we also find in the oracles a stunning image of Hecate's left and right flanks or thighs. Again, anyone making a painting for their creative project, please do this one. It reads, "Around the hollow of her right flank, a great stream of primordially generated soul gushes forth in abundance, totally ensouling light, fire, ether, worlds. In the left flank of Hekate exists the source of virtue, which remains entirely within and does not give up its virginity. In these philosophical and other magical or esoteric traditions, Hekate becomes particularly associated with messenger angels bearing the epithet Hekate Angelos, and also with whirling wheels or eunuchs, instruments of spells and divinations, as well as with the dark and demonic or ill-tempered dogs of nature who enchant souls." If you're interested in the place of Hekate in the Chaldean oracles, I've also done another video on this in my course on ancient philosophy, Introduction to Neoplatonism, which you can check out on YouTube. On how Hekate was remembered in the early to late Christian Middle Ages, up to Renaissance and modern times, D'Este brings together some key quotes, this being just a brief selection. In the 10th century Byzantine Suda, quote, "Some say that she is Artemis, others the moon, appearing in strange manifestation for those invoking curses. Her manifestations are humans with the heads of dragons and of immense size, so that the sight stupefies those who see it." In 1584, the philosopher Giordano Bruno, in his Incantations to Circe, sings, "I name you the one whom we call Hekate, Latona, Diana, Phoebe, Lucina, Trivia, Tergamina, and the threefold goddess." Hekate is probably most remembered from Shakespeare, both Macbeth and the Midsummer's Night Dream, where he writes, "Now it is the time of night, that the graves all gaping wide, everyone lets forth his sprite, in the churchways paths to glide. And we fairies that do run by the triple Hecate's team, from the presence of the sun, following darkness like a dream. Now we frolic." Amazingly, Hecate's worship survived in various forms underground after the rise of Christianity, and mentions of her become increasingly common after the Renaissance, such as in Bruno or Shakespeare above, but also in Christopher Marlowe, Oscar Wilde, and many, many others. While there are probably no direct connections here, D'Este notes that the goddess Libertas, or Liberty, ever shone with a torch, and wearing a crown of spikes, as in the Statue of Liberty here on the right, is remarkably similar to images of Hekate, especially this Chiaramonte Hekate here, which you can see in the Vatican Museum. This really shows the extreme continuum of ways in which the iconography of Hekate was preserved in the modern world. On the one hand, the darksome goddess of witches and witchcraft, on the other, the goddess and the Statue of Liberty. No introductory treatment of Hekate could be considered complete without mentioning one of the strangest myths we inherit from the most ancient traditions, in which the mortal Iphigenia herself becomes Hekate, after she is sacrificed by Agamemnon at the beginning of the Trojan War. Iphigenia's transformation is related in Pausanias and also in Stesichorus. In Pausanias we read, "Now I have heard another account of Iphigenia that is given by the Arcadians, and that I know that Hesiod, in his poem A Catalogue of Women, says that Iphigenia did not die, but by the will of Artemis became Hekate." Unfortunately, this part of Hesiod's Catalogue of Women poems does not survive, except as a reconstructed fragment from Pausanias and Stesichorus. There are two possibilities of interpretation here, which D'Este cites from a 1974 article by Berg. Either Hesiod only names Iphigenia Enodia. It's possible that Hesiod never named Hekate at all here, but called the sacrificed Iphigenia Enodia. of the road, and this attribute was later thought to mean Hekate as guardian of crossroads. Or, and this is the really tantalizing bit, the possibility should not be overlooked that Hesiod did really mean Enodia to signify the traditional goddess Hekate. Hesiod knew, in other words, an old tradition which actually identified Ephemedia with Hekate. If this is the case, then according to Sarah Ilse Johnson, Artemis neither allowed the girl to die nor spirited her away to become a priestess. Rather, the goddess Artemis caused Iphigenia to become Hekate. This is not an origin myth of Hekate per se, who clearly pre-existed this scene, but rather a rare and almost unheard of example where a mortal human becomes the same as a pre-existing goddess at her death. Sarah Ilse Johnston had earlier written Hekate Sotyra, but you can pick up her latest thoughts on Hekate in her book The Restless Dead, Encounters Between the Living and the Dead in Ancient Greece. In Chapter 6, Hekate and the Dying Maiden, she gives an amazing overview of Hekate and interprets this very riddling scene. Quote, by identifying Iphigenia with Hekate, the myth in Hesiod seems to be saying that this girl in particular, who had died before her proper time, became afterwards not just any vengeful ghost, but the vengeful ghost, the quintessential leader of other unhappy, prematurely dead souls. We don't have time to interpret Johnston's 2 books related to Hekate here, but for a really fun introduction, you can check out her interview on Hekate on the Schwepp History of Esotericism podcast, in which this and many other Hekate myths are discussed. Again, when it comes to Hekate, the quality of the scholarship and studies out there is just really over-the-top excellent. Maybe the 3 most important books I would recommend you add to your library on Hekate are Hekate Sotyra, edited and introduced by Ruth Majercik, and this text we've been studying here, Circle for Hekate. Then you can add The Restless Dead and also Daughters of Hekate, Women and Magic in the Ancient World. And then for good measure, you should throw into the mix Stephen Ronin's edited volume The Goddess Hekate, as well as the Greek magical papyri in translation, and lastly Soraya's Deste's earlier books, Artemis, Virgin Goddess of Sun and Moon, and Hekate, Liminal Rites. Let's now bring this lecture to a close by sorting out this triple goddess idea and reevaluating with Deste the evidence for a Maiden-Mother-Crone archetype, or what she calls the MMC hypothesis. As we've seen, Hekate is definitely a maiden goddess and sometimes a mother goddess. She's Parthenos and mater, like Athena. However, like in Steve Moore, the idea of a crone is foreign to our ancient sources for Hekate. Deste, quite a bit more humbly than Moore, leaves open the idea that maybe Hekate has revealed herself anew to modern devotees, but she doesn't seem so into this idea and wants us to look into the sources, which, though challenging, show how the idea of Hekate as a crone originated. Deste thus points, like Moore, to the monolithic nature of this construction, wherein all goddesses become reducible to the 3 lunar or maturational aspects of one great goddess. She writes, not all women have a choice in experiencing the Mother-Maiden-Crone phases of life in a straightforward and predictable way. And for some, the MMC can become uncomfortable and problematic. This includes women who have been unable to fulfill their desire to have a child, women who had their maidenhood taken away from them by force, women who decided not to have children for whatever reason, and women who experienced menopause early. The MMC paradigm tends to exclude these and some other women. So how did the Mother-Maiden-Crone idea get going in the first place? Although Jane Harrison is often cited as its originator in her book Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion, what Harrison actually says is that Greek goddesses may be characterized as maidens, mothers, or something other. Harrison was much more concerned with how the epithets Parthenos and mater, which were compatible for her, like in Karenyi, ended up being separated and replaced with an all-maiden triple goddess, such as we've seen in the Graces, the Fates, and the Horai, etc. Quote from Harrison, once the triple form is established, it is noticeable in Greek mythology that the 3 figures are always regarded as maiden goddesses, but not as mothers. They may have taken their rise in the mother and in the maid, but the mother falls utterly away. This is, of course, part of the process of increasing patriarchalization of Greek religion. And Deste shows here pretty definitively that it's not in Jane Harrison that the MMC hypothesis gets going, or if it is, it's only by way of misunderstanding her. According to Deste, the earliest mention she's able to find of Hekate with attributes that fit the archetype of the crone is in the work of the controversial magician and occult writer Aleister Crowley. In one invocation, Crowley sings Hekate, veiled with a shining veil, utterly frail, the frailness here referring to age. And in another work, Moonchild, Crowley declares of the triple lunar goddess that thirdly, she is Hekate, a thing altogether of hell, barren, hideous, and malicious, a queen of death and evil witchcraft. Hekate is the crone, the woman past all hope of motherhood, her soul black with envy and hatred of happier mortals. This highly male-parsed and utterly misogynistic invocation to Hekate as crone is, according to D'Este, the first reference to Hekate as an old woman or crone. Although Crowley is the first to refer to Hekate as a crone, it is Robert Graves who popularizes a similar conception. In his famous and still widely read book on the Greek myths, Graves writes that Cora, Persephone, and Hekate were clearly the goddess triad as maiden, nymph, and crone, at a time when women practiced the mysteries of agriculture. Graves sometimes speaks of the middle term here as nymph, a nubile woman ready for marriage, and sometimes as a mother who bears children, rather than simply have it out for Graves, as we saw in Steve Moore. D'Este seems to appreciate his creativity a bit. Graves's work wasn't meant to be an accurate historical record, but a creative retelling. In any case, the outcome is the same. Crowley and Graves encouraged by riding on the petticoats of modern literary prejudices about Hekate as, quote, old women with crooked noses living on the edges of society, stories which are usually told to scare children and probably hoodwink some of the uneducated. For D'Este, Hekate fits comfortably in the maiden and mother position, but not in the crone. The closest thing we have to an ancient mother-maiden-crone triple goddess in Greek myth is, as we've seen, the trio of Persephone, Demeter, and Hekate in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. However, there, as we'll explore later in the course, Hekate is actually a second maiden who supports Demeter, just as Persephone is the maiden who becomes a mother. The crone here, if there is one, is Demeter, but only in her disguised and grieving form as a mortal. On how to interpret this, D'Este points out that age is simply irrelevant to deathless gods and goddesses. Although goddesses might be younger or more mature, they are always old, just not old in the sense of mortal aging. This without exception. So what have we learned in this lecture on Artemis, Selene, and Hekate? Well, for one, this is one of the most complicated areas that there is in the study of Greek myth. The attributes, functions, and symbols of Artemis, Selene, and Hekate do frequently overlap. They might all appear with torches, daggers, swords, whips, bows, keys, spears, baskets, dogs, bulls, cattle, horses, lions, poppies, rays of light, and many, many others. Additionally, these three goddesses are often syncretized in religious, in magical, and in philosophical traditions, maybe from the Greek Dark Ages and even earlier, but definitely from the 5th to the 2nd centuries BCE, and then increasingly. Nevertheless, the mythologies of these three goddesses did at the same time remain distinct in myth and cult. Hekate and Artemis did acquire lunar associations, such that the philosopher Porphyry could speak of the phases of Hekate as a triple moon. And it seems that these associations in Neoplatonism are what prevailed. In later historical memory, often it was only the Neoplatonists who were preserved and remembered. And so in the 12th century CE, we hear in the Byzantine poet John Tzetzes that Selene, Artemis, and Hekate are the same. Such notions were already present in Seneca's play The Medea in the 1st century CE, where Trivia or Hekate was associated with 3 lunar phases, and Callimachus, the Greek poet, as early as the 3rd century BCE, linked Artemis to the moon and put in her hands a silver rather than a golden bow. For Sorita D'Este, it is possible that Hekate had earlier lunar associations. What is our takeaway from all this enormous complexity of the topic? We might simply observe that evidence tends to be arranged differently, depending on what criteria we are using and how well we learn to dig. We've seen in this lecture how Steve Moore wanted admirably to purify the mythology and the cave or dream associations of Selene. We saw also how Otto and Heidegger were quite content to treat Artemis separately, with virtually no mention of Selene and Hekate. And we've seen also how Hesiod gave us much cause to wonder about these tendencies. At this point, one either wishes to read the Greek magical papyri and take them seriously or not. It is one's own taste which determines a gravitation towards Homeric, archaic, or classical myth, or later Roman or Hellenistic syncretism. Whether it be more or less esoteric, pretty much we've learned that either combining or separating these three goddesses is an enormous and in the end impossible juggling act, which depends on one's preferences and predilections, and above all on the quality of one's scholarship, if not also one's stage of spiritual development. The issue of both the unity and the difference of these three goddesses will never be resolved. What we can say is that approaches to each of these goddesses in isolation, and to all the compelling material for their association as a triple moon goddess, are both worth a fair hearing. Let's conclude this lecture with a reading of the two very short hymns to Hekate we find in the Orphic hymns and in Proclus. The Orphic hymn sings, "Lovely Hekate of the roads and of the crossroads I invoke, in heaven, on earth, then in the sea. Saffron-cloaked, tomb spirit reveling in the souls of the dead, daughter of Perses, haunting deserted places, delighting in deer, nocturnal, dog-loving, monstrous queen, devouring wild beasts, ungirt and repulsive, herder of bulls, queen and mistress of the whole world, leader, nymph, mountain-roaming nurturer of youth, maiden, I beseech you come to these holy rites, ever with joyous heart, ever favoring the ox-herd." This hymn again reminds us that Hekate received more formal worship in antiquity, both civic and private, than almost any other god or goddess except Zeus. She was a goddess of crossroads, Enodia, and any place that could receive offerings and would contain an image of the goddess. She was much involved in mystery cults, but ever liminal and ever ambiguous in her identity and transmission. And this is because crossroads are ever a confluence of three roads, like the place that Oedipus encountered and slew his father Laius, a place where three roads meet. Hesiod told us that Hekate was a goddess of all three realms, and the Orphic poet agrees. Here she is saffron-cloaked, like the moon and Melanoe, and she as well revels in the Bacchic ceremony, much like Artemis in the Orphic hymn to Artemis. Although much darker in Artemis here, she is still described as a Croatrophos, nurturer of youth, and again, like Artemis, she favors all the animals of the wild with a joyous heart and ever loves the ox-herd. What makes her distinctive here, however, is her close companionship with the spirits of the dead. The Orphics here going deeper than Hesiod's Hekate or his muses, who both receive only lavish praise. This Hekate is ungirt and repulsive, a monstrous queen, and yet one we would do well never to forget. Proclus sings movingly to Hekate, and Janus faced Zeus in the same breath. "Hail, O mother of the gods who have many names, blessed and beautiful offspring. Hail Hekate, frequenter of the porch, powerful. Hail to you too, O forefather Janus, undying Zeus. Hail, supreme Zeus. Make the passage of life glorious, bristling with good things. And drive pain from my body, draw in my soul, which rages madly around the material realm. Purify it by the rites that awaken the intellect. I pray to you, give me your hand. Show me the way revealed by the gods. I crave it. I will observe the precious light by which it is possible to escape the evil of dark birth. Yea, I pray to you, give me your hand, and bring me with your winds, exhausted as I am, to the harbor of piety." And with this hymn, Proclus returns us to the beginning of Hecate's mythos, the mystery of her close yet unspoken relationship with Zeus. Here, Janus-faced or double-sided Zeus, Chthonic and Uranian, again asking the goddess Hekate, queen of the world's soul, for a litany of blessings. Glorious life, good things, the absence of pain, the drawing into the world's soul and the cosmic mind, a good birth in future lives, but above all for the wind of her inspiration. Proclus calls to Hekate at his most exhausted moment, and what he asks is for her to escort him into the harbor of piety. And with this we come to the conclusion of this lecture. Artemis, Selene, Hekate, the triple goddess, no? Or the triple goddess, yes? See what you think in the discussion this week, and thanks for listening to this lecture. See you all next time when we cover Apollo and then Hermes.